John has been a member of the chapter for several years. He emigrated to the boutique network world from Skadden, specializing in a phrase that I never had heard of until I met John, CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. It has become an extraordinarily critical agency that is dealing with issues that are, top of mind, and the most immediate one of attention is obviously the TikTok transaction. And if you don't know what TikTok is, you got to find a 12-year-old and ask them about it. But it deals with the investments of foreign entities into the U.S. with technology and the like, and concerns about data privacy, about various technological theft, and it's becoming an absolutely critical area. And for INBLF to have this kind of expertise, particularly with international memberships, is in my view absolutely essential on a long-term basis. So let us welcome John, and we look forward to his presentation.
Thank you, Arnie. Let me go ahead and share my screen now, and then I will get into the presentation. So yes, I am John Kabealo. I've been in INBLF for 2 or 3 years now in the DC chapter. And as Arnie said, I was, prior to going solo, I was at Skadden Arps. I started there as an M&A attorney in the New York office. And then back in 2011, Skadden was in the process of forming a group that focused specifically on CFIUS. And I've always said that it's one of the benefits of being at a massive firm is that you can find these strange niches. And in 2011, CFIUS was very much an obscure niche that few people had ever heard of. And as I get into it now, recently the co-head of global mergers and acquisitions at JP Morgan Chase, he referred to CFIUS as the ultimate regulatory bazooka in the Trump administration's arsenal of trade war tools. And that was after the Trump administration in 2018 unilaterally blocked a $117 billion hostile takeover bid by Broadcom for Qualcomm. And that was a transaction that caught a lot of people's attention in the M&A world, because it was one of the largest transactions at the time, and the administration jumped in actually before even the CFIUS process had fully concluded, and blocked the transaction. So I think that was really a wake-up call to people who were sort of paying attention to mergers and acquisitions and the trade war between the US and China. But recently there have been some additional cases that have caught the eye of people who even don't necessarily pay attention to regulatory aspects of mergers and acquisitions. And those include the forced divestiture of the social media and dating app Grindr that had been acquired by a Chinese acquirer in 2018. They were forced to divest in 2019. For full disclosure, I had a role in that transaction, so I can't really say anything beyond what was made publicly available. But I think I can say with great confidence that a lot of people heard about that and wondered how could a dating app have national security implications on the United States. And then again, people are asking a similar question as President Trump has issued his edict that the Chinese acquirer of the owner of TikTok divest its U.S. operations. In particular, that was a Chinese acquisition of another Chinese business. And so how in the world could the President of the United States force a Chinese company to divest operations of another Chinese company after an acquisition? And so I think that illustrates sort of the broad reach and the vast power of this committee known as CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And so this presentation is intended to give INBLF members just sort of a basic overview of what CFIUS is and how it operates. And I would give the lawyerly caveat that almost everything that I say in this presentation, I'm trying to hew very closely to sort of the main narrative about CFIUS. But almost everything that I say, there are caveats and details that that are of great importance if you find yourself potentially facing a CFIUS issue. One other thing I would say at the outset, I'm thrilled to be presenting to INBLF, in particular because of obviously our international reach, but also one of the main policy goals of the U.S. and the member agencies of CFIUS is to promote the idea of foreign direct investment reviews around the world and to coordinate those reviews among, in particular, NATO allies, so many countries in the EU, most of whom have some sort of a regime, but this administration and the prior administration, the Obama administration, are actively encouraging countries to stand up their own review processes and then facilitate coordination among nations as they undertake these reviews. So I think it's timely both because of what's going on in the United States, but also because this is something that will be of increasing importance around the world over the next 5 to 10 years. So, one more note. If you have any questions, I guess for the sake of people who might be watching this as it's recorded, please just hold the questions to the end. And if you care to, you can put them, I guess, in the chat function, and I can look at them after I go through the main body of the presentation. So CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It is a federal interagency committee. It is chaired by the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and other member agencies include the Department of Defense, Justice, Homeland Security, Energy, State, Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Those are the voting members of CFIUS. There are a few members also that observe as well. What CFIUS does, it reviews foreign investments into U.S. businesses. Where one of those investments may threaten to impair the U.S. national security, CFIUS and the President of the United States has the authority to suspend or block the transaction, or to place conditions on the transaction prior to approving it. Its authority exists in perpetuity for parties to transactions that have not undergone a CFIUS review and gotten clearance by CFIUS. In fact, I am currently working on an enforcement action for an investment that occurred in 2011, and CFIUS just in February contacted the parties and initiated an enforcement action against the parties. So the long arm of the law and sort of the idea that the government never forgets really is absolutely the case. In addition, there is no dollar threshold. You know, I talked about the Trump administration blocking a $117 billion transaction. They also have reviewed transactions that are in the $100,000, $200,000 range. They've taken enforcement action against large and small transactions because the concept of national security isn't limited by dollar value. Really, even a small company, if they have some sort of cutting edge technology that could be of interest or could impact the US national security, they are subject to this jurisdiction. So the statutory authorizations for CFIUS, it stems from the Defense Production Act of 1950. It did not, CFIUS wasn't invented in 1950, but it is attached to that authorization. Just recently, it's at the behest of the agencies during the Obama administration, Congress greatly expanded CFIUS authorizations to review a broader set of transactions. And that was codified by the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018. So this is just a list of their authorities. What I would say generally, if you look at 31 CFR Part 800, that is the meat and bones of what CFIUS does. In the 2018 expansion of their authorizations, Congress clarified that CFIUS also has the authority to review investments in real estate. So it's not just investments in business, it's the purchase or lease of certain real estate assets as well, primarily airports, seaports, and real estate properties that have proximity to military installations. So what actually does CFIUS do? What do they care about? Their substantive interest was clarified in the 2018 expansion, primarily to talk about what they call TID businesses. So any business that has certain types of technology, any business that operates in the critical infrastructure, so the energy grid, or the financial system, or telecommunications assets, those sorts of things. And also companies that collect data. And the illustrative list of data in the recent legislative changes, that data is described as sensitive personal data, and that's sort of the nexus to Grindr and TikTok. Those companies capture user communications to one another, and a whole host of other personal data. The one thing I would say, they made explicit CFIUS concerns about sensitive personal data, but of course there's a whole host of other companies that collect things that aren't personal data. But you can imagine, for instance, if a foreign company wanted to acquire QuickBooks, or a company that had vast amounts of data of what enterprises are doing, that could well create a CFIUS issue. So sort of expanding on the list of what CFIUS focuses on substantively, there's a concept known as critical technologies, and really these are defined as kind of any technology that requires export licenses from one of the many different agencies that provide export licenses for companies in the US to export their technologies. As I mentioned, critical infrastructure companies, also the government supply chain. Any company that has contracts with the US government, if there's a foreign investment in one of those companies, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem, but those are the types of transactions that CFIUS likes to review in advance. Real estate, as we mentioned, and emerging and foundational technologies. This is a subset of critical technologies, which I mentioned before. The reason I'm calling it out specifically, emerging and foundational technologies are specifically defined in the CFIUS statute. They have not yet, they are currently an empty set. What the law required is that the Department of Commerce and the Department of Defense come up with a list of technologies that qualify as emerging technologies, and technologies that qualify as foundational technologies. As of yet, they have not done that. However, when that happens, I think most observers expect that, in particular, emerging technologies are going to have a big effect on the venture capital community and the startup community in the US, because by their very nature, emerging technologies are new, cutting-edge technologies that are often invented and developed by very, very small companies. And as we'll see in a minute, emerging and foundational technologies, they trigger a special type of review by CFIUS. So switching now from the substantive focus to the structural focus, CFIUS reviews acquisitions of controlling stakes in US businesses, but that's, to call it controlling is almost a misnomer. An equity acquisition of 10% or greater in a US business can trigger a finding of control by CFIUS. It is absolutely not an investment where you acquire 51% or more of a target's equity. And that's sort of a fundamental concept that's well known to CFIUS practitioners, but seems almost absurd to the outside world that you could control a company if you have as little as 10% of the equity in it. That authority existed and it predated the expansion of CFIUS authorities in 2018. In 2018, Congress provided CFIUS authority to review additional transactions at a lower threshold. So any investment that provides the investor a board seat or a board observer seat, no matter the size of the investment, can trigger or does trigger CFIUS jurisdiction. Any investment that provides the investor access to material non-public technical information also triggers CFIUS jurisdiction. And any investment that provides the investor any other influence over substantive decision making with respect to the target's technology also triggers CFIUS jurisdiction. It's important to note, in particular in the M&A context, a lot of times an acquiring entity will form a subsidiary to effect the acquisition. So a foreign company may form a Delaware corporation to make an acquisition in the US. CFIUS operates entirely on a look-through basis to the ultimate controlling person. So, having a Delaware company do the investment for you doesn't really have any effect on the CFIUS analysis. Similarly, this is a huge issue in the investment fund community. There are all sorts of investment funds that are headquartered in the US and controlled by US persons, but they may have a substantial investment from an overseas person. In certain instances, that substantial investment by an overseas person can cause the fund itself to be deemed a foreign person, and so then its investments count as foreign investments in US businesses. The last point is that joint ventures where a US company is contributing assets or technology to a non-US entity, that also can trigger CFIUS jurisdiction. So, just from this slide alone, you can see that there are a lot of different hooks into investment transactions where CFIUS authority can trigger. And I want to pause for a minute here because if you have a US business and if you have a foreign investor and any of these elements are present, then technically CFIUS jurisdiction is triggered. So it's not only triggered because the US business does something that has a bearing on US national security, it's triggered for any investment in a US business. And the difference is there's just very little risk of enforcement if, you know, it's a non-US investment in a bagel shop or something. You can safely assume that that's not something that CFIUS cares about, and there's no duty to report that transaction, although you do have always the option to voluntarily report to CFIUS. So in addition to the structural issues mentioned on this slide, there are certain issues specific to acquirers. While CFIUS jurisdiction is country neutral for the most part, it applies evenly across the board to all countries, with a couple of exceptions for UK, Canada, and Australia investments. There are certain substantive issues posed by acquirers. So if you are an investor and you are owned by a foreign government, and that can either be an operating company like a foreign oil company, or tons of countries have what are referred to as sovereign wealth funds, where it's just an investment vehicle, even potentially for pensions for government employees in that country. Canada has at least a dozen retirement funds that count as state-owned entities. The country of domicile can impact a CFIUS review, in particular because in the expansion of CFIUS authorizations, Congress was very clear that any country that has declared adversarial intentions to the United States are to receive higher scrutiny and are of greater concern to Congress, which therefore means that CFIUS has more of a mandate to review transactions from those countries. You can imagine, as that has borne out, the focus is sort of extreme on investments from Chinese and Russian companies. There are, however, in certain cases, there are some countries that can be surprisingly thorny for U.S. national security purposes. Additionally, CFIUS looks at the particular acquirer, no matter where they're domiciled. What is their history of compliance with U.S. and international law? So if you've had problems violating U.S. export control laws in the past, or if you've had problems complying with international sanctions regimes, if you go to make an investment in the U.S., that is a factor that CFIUS considers. And it certainly doesn't mean that your investment will get blocked by CFIUS, but it's going to be an issue that you have to work through in the review. I mentioned that the law is largely country neutral. However, there is one minor carve out for investments from Canadian, UK, and Australian investors, and those are investments of that lower threshold, where if you're making an investment under 10%, but you get a board seat, or you get access to technology, or you have substantive or influence over substantive decision making with respect to technology. If you're from Canada, the UK, or Australia, those investments do not trigger CFIUS jurisdiction, or they don't trigger mandatory filings with CFIUS. But however, if you do make one of the acquisitions of control, which is again is a very low threshold, you don't get a carve out, even if you're from Canada, UK, or Australia. So now the weirdest thing about CFIUS is that until 2018, CFIUS operated entirely on a voluntary filing regime. And what this meant is that Anybody who engaged in a transaction that triggered CFIUS jurisdiction was subject to CFIUS jurisdiction in perpetuity. However, the only way to go to CFIUS was voluntarily, because you as a party identified this issue, you knew about CFIUS, and you went to CFIUS with a filing, and you described your transaction. They reviewed it and cleared your transaction. At that point, the jurisdiction in perpetuity stops, and you have a safe harbor against any further action by CFIUS. So what makes sense here is, you sign up to a transaction, and then like any other regulatory review, before you close the transaction, you go and you get your regulatory approval. Now it's changed a bit, because CFIUS has said that certain transactions trigger a mandatory filing, and so investments in companies that develop critical technology, as we mentioned before, that's technology that requires, generally speaking, US export authorizations. Those investments can trigger a mandatory filing. Also, investments by state-owned or state-controlled investors can trigger mandatory filings. And I mentioned before that there's sort of a caveat to everything I said. This is a very sort of complicated part of the CFIUS regulations. But so now what we have is we have sort of some transactions trigger mandatory filings, but jurisdiction attaches to all transactions that meet the structural thresholds. So even if you don't trigger a mandatory filing, you still are subject to jurisdiction in perpetuity unless you voluntarily go to CFIUS and get their approval. So it's sort of a mixed bag, and it's not very clear. But I can say with a high degree of confidence that there's a broad swath of transactions that don't trigger mandatory filings that still confer a great deal of risk if you don't voluntarily file with CFIUS and get clearance. Now, if you fail to file a mandatory transaction, CFIUS has the authority to penalize you, both parties, up to the value of the transaction for failing to file. So they really can drop the hammer on you. And then in addition to the monetary penalties, they still can unwind your transaction if you didn't get CFIUS approval. And as I mentioned, the enforcement authority exists in perpetuity if you don't get CFIUS approval. So in terms of the process, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. Again, there's sort of whether or not you're in a mandatory filing situation or a voluntary filing situation, the way you run the process is the same. There's a long form process where if you know that you have a transaction that they're going to want to take a look at for whatever reason you identify, you can file a long form notice to CFIUS, and that triggers a review by the staff. They comment on your notice, and then once you account for all of their comments, then you file a formal notice. It's very similar to working with the SEC for anybody who's ever done that. It's very interactive with the staff, and it takes a long time. It takes, I would say, about a month to get your notice to CFIUS, get comments, revise your notice, and formally file it. And then that triggers a 45-day review. If needed, an additional 45-day investigation, and then only in very rare circumstances, an additional 15-day review by the president himself. And that's extremely rare, the 15-day presidential review. Now, separate from that, if you have a transaction that triggers CFIUS jurisdiction, but you don't think that it's all that concerning to them, but you still just want the assurance that they've looked at it and cleared you, so that you won't be subject to this perpetual jurisdiction. There's a short form process as well, known as a declaration process. It's a much shorter set of disclosures that you make. You file that, and the clock starts pretty quickly, and that review only takes 30 days. The issue with that one is that if you're wrong, they may then ask you to then file the long form notice. So then, you've sort of just added 30 more days to your total process. So I tend to only recommend that in cases where it's pretty clear that there are no issues. But if there could be any interest at all by the agencies, you're usually better off just going right to the long form notice process. I guess one other thing that I would say, until 2 weeks ago, it was a very sort of informal process where you would email documents to CFIUS, and all correspondence occurred over email. It's not like a courtroom setting, or there's not a lot of formality to it. They did just recently change, and instead of just an email-based system, they have a portal where you sort of have to log in and interact with the committee and upload information through this portal. So, as CFIUS is sort of becoming more well-known, it's also sort of becoming a bit more formal. But still, interactions with the staff are very, very friendly. It doesn't feel like you're being prosecuted when you appear before CFIUS. So I've mentioned all of this stuff about how CFIUS reviews transactions. They have these vast authorities to fine you, to block your transactions. President Trump is making announcements frequently about what they're going to do to this or that transaction. The more common approach, if you have a transaction and they do have concerns, usually I'd say 80 to 90% of the time, what happens is you negotiate a mitigation agreement with CFIUS. And what that is most companies and most acquirers, the entire company is not sensitive, or the business intent of the investor is not to have access to the crown jewel, most sensitive aspect of the business. For a lot of businesses, the sensitive thing they do isn't even core to the business. It's, they perform a couple of services for the U.S. government, and the government wants to make sure that service is not interrupted, or information about that service is not accessed or distributed internationally. So CFIUS will come to you, or if you're sort of familiar with these issues, you can proactively go to CFIUS and propose a national security agreement prior to the expiration of the second stage 45-day review or investigation. And basically, it's just a package of conditions where you say, we're going to limit access to this aspect of the business, or if we have source code, we're going to continue to store it in the US. Or if we have data, we're going to continue to store it in the US and not allow non-US access to US persons' data, things like that. And I just recently was doing one where there was the company made component pieces to nuclear weapons. Similar deal. It was a very, very small thing that they did relative to their overall business. But we make component pieces for nuclear weapons is kind of the peak of U.S. national security concerns. But we went to the Department of Energy and said, look, we understand that you're going to have concerns here. We can very much give you contractual assurances that you will continue to have supply from this company. The supply will be at the same quality that you currently are getting it at. It'll be made at the same factory in the same location where it's currently being made. And it's about a week or so of discussions with the Department of Energy and DoD to come up with a very friendly and very acceptable set of conditions that ultimately had the effect of assuring the U.S. business and its foreign acquirer that they were going to have a very eager and long-term customer in the U.S. government going forward. So I think it's important to emphasize that in most cases, the interests of all the parties can very much align pretty neatly, and it's only in rare instances where that can't happen, and CFIUS has to recommend a block, or they recommend conditions that are so difficult for the parties to operate under that the acquirer no longer wants to move forward with the transaction. That sort of takes us into transaction considerations, but I don't think I want to spend a ton of time on this. If people have specific questions, I'm happy to get into it. But it suffices to say that CFIUS issues, they kind of run from the inception of a transaction in the way that it's being structured all the way through closing the transaction. And so at each stage, there's something that you need to do to address CFIUS concerns if you have a transaction that could be on their radar. This is just a sampling of recently blocked and abandoned deals. Most of these didn't receive a ton of public attention. Another thing, that's another unique aspect of CFIUS. Apart from when the parties or maybe the president start talking about a transaction, CFIUS itself is bound by confidentiality, and there is no public docket for CFIUS transactions. There's no way to access this information except if there is public reporting about it. So it's a very sort of niche and very obscure practice, and it's also very hard to learn about except through experience, which I guess as a practitioner isn't the worst thing, but it can make the conversations around it a bit difficult. Keys to a successful CFIUS review all sort of stem back to identifying the issue and sort of getting everyone's buy-in early and sort of proactively approaching the process instead of viewing it with resistance and reluctance, which is an understandable and natural instinct of parties to a transaction. It's not everybody's favorite thing to say that you need to voluntarily subject yourself to a national security review by the US government. There are a ton of benefits of filing, notwithstanding the fact that it slows down your transaction and you kind of have to get the third degree from the US government. It's a great way to get assurance that 9 years after you do a transaction, the government's not going to come knocking on your door and have problems with what you did. In particular, because the transaction that I worked on that occurred 9 years ago, I think if they had filed at the time, they would have gotten through. There really wasn't much there, but perceptions and political winds change, and they had this tail risk that things changed over time and they didn't handle it, and so it really it's an important and a good way to get total assurance that you're not going to find yourself in this sort of very crazy situation where the US government has come after you. I guess the last thing, there are a ton of INBLF members who do things that are related to CFIUS, most crucially government contracts and federal communications issues and antitrust issues. But all of the things that I've listed here are issues that can either trigger a CFIUS review or can indicate that there are issues with your company that if you're taking investment, you should consider going to CFIUS. And then in your CFIUS filing, there are disclosures about each of these issues. So it really, one of the things that I love about being a CFIUS practitioner is that you get to work with all sorts of other regulatory specialists and coordinate with them. And so you're kind of always learning about new things and always working with interesting businesses who are doing really, really neat things. Yeah, so that's it for the formal presentation, and I'm happy to discuss any questions if anyone has any, although I don't know how to get back to the chat function.
There aren't currently any questions in the chat, so if you have questions for John, feel free to just go ahead and ask them.
Can I ask a question, John?
Please.
If you're able to get to the chat. So this is Marcine, and I'm actually from the Silicon Valley, and I do immigration law.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would have to say that there are very many of my clients, especially in the investments. I have foreign investors investing to get green cards here and work cards in the United States. They basically invest lots of money in either their own business or they perhaps purchase a business. And typically, because of the way that the immigration law is structured, they actually own more than 51% of the entity that they're purchasing, or they're investing a huge amount of money for an EB-5 investment into large infrastructure. So this has been just an amazing eye-opener for me, as far as I think that pretty much, because the criteria, as you said, is so low, that probably every single one of my clients that I've helped to obtain a green card for or work visa are probably subject to CFIUS. But I have no idea whether, it was on their radar screen because I didn't handle the corporate transactional part of the deal. But, now I'm worried, wow, some of them could be basically infinitely, perpetually on the hook. So is there any way that they could go back and try to get that now? Or is it just like they've missed their opportunity? It's too bad. So they've closed the door on themselves and they've left themselves open for all eternity for CFIUS to come after them.
No, that's
I'm sorry.
You never want to trigger anxiety when you talk about CFIUS, but they are very receptive to post-closing filings, and I think it's becoming something that they hear a lot. Like, somebody did a transaction and didn't know that CFIUS existed, and then found out about it and said, "Oh my God, I don't want CFIUS to knock on my door." And so you can, years after you've closed, you can make a filing with CFIUS. And one of the things that you do in your filing is you explain what the rationale behind the transaction is or was. And the best thing you can do in your filing is provide them with a very compelling and very coherent explanation for why you did the transaction. And I wanted to come to America, so I invested in an American business is something that would immediately make sense to them, and very much help your case. Now, I would go back to, you can yourself sort of gauge how likely it is that CFIUS is going to knock on your door based on what was the business that they invested in. How long ago was that investment, and those sorts of things. And so a lot of what we do in cases like this is not go and make a filing to CFIUS, but just sort of go back and look at the facts and come up with the story in case CFIUS ever does come knocking on your door. Just marshal the facts and come up with the arguments.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm hoping that corporate counsel, my counterpart, had looked into this, but I didn't specifically ask them about it. So now I'm thinking I have no idea whether that assessment was made or not. So thank you.
Another thing I would say, I get calls all the time about, just should I even be thinking about CFIUS in X or Y scenario? Those sorts of things are very easy to do, and generally I like to do those, not with an engagement or on the clock, but just a general, yes, I think there may be some risk, or generally no, this doesn't seem like something that is likely to trigger any sort of issue, and usually you can sort of sort through that stuff pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, if the technology is on the export control list, then it triggers, some due diligence on our part. But other than that, I don't really, I wouldn't make that assessment further than going towards critical infrastructure or anything critical technology that was on the export control list.
Right,
so, yeah.
Right.
And Marcine and John, along the same vein, since I'm an immigration practitioner, there must be an intersection between CFIUS and the EB5 world, but I would think it's more with the large projects who take in multiple or possibly hundreds of investments from foreign nationals, and they end up owning, not one foreign national will own the project, but I suspect the 100 investors have the majority of the ownership. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is a question that is coming up in various forms, sort of all over the map. What happens if you have a distributed base of investors, not one of whom would be seen as controlling the investment? And really, similar to how I said there's an exception for everything that I was talking about. If you have 100 foreign investors who own 60% of a business, let's say, but you still have one U.S. investor who owns 40%, then that 40% owner is still generally the dominant investor who still would be seen as having control over the business. And so it's hard to know who, in that scenario, who would you even be filing on behalf of? You're not going to make 100 different filings, or one filing naming 100 different investors. But if they aggregate their investments in a single investment entity, and that entity could be seen as controlling the U.S. business, then I think you have a cleaner and clearer case that you probably do have a CFIUS filing to make. So it really sort of, I hate giving this answer, but it does depend on sort of the facts and circumstances of the investment.
Thank you.
Hey, John, it's Larry Friedman from Barnes in Chicago. First of all, thanks for doing this. It's really great. As you know, I do work on the BIS and DDT side of things. So I have a question about the timing. If you're going to do a voluntary notice or a short form notice, then because a transaction's occurring, like for DDTC, the State Department requires notifications, pre-transaction notifications, that there's going to be a change in ownership of the company.
Right.
For BIS, once you start sharing information with the potential acquirer, it's likely that you might need an export license for the deemed export of the technical information. Do those applications, those notifications, show up on the radar at CFIUS? CFIUS knows that something's afoot, and if that's the case, does the timing of doing those notifications to state or license applications to commerce have anything to say about your timing for doing a notification to CFIUS?
That's a great question. The answer with respect to DDTC is a lot clearer because that one has a defined time frame on it. 60 days pre-closing, you submit your notice, and generally that runs parallel to CFIUS. And you probably have seen in the new DDTC disclosures, explicitly ask you if you're also filing with CFIUS. And that's because state is a member agency of CFIUS, and if there's a transaction that they get through DDTC, they can alert CFIUS if you say that you're not going to file with CFIUS. BIS, they can notify CFIUS if they get a license application. What I've found more often is that it works the other way, where CFIUS will farm something out to BIS because they have a question about whether or not a license was appropriately requested or obtained. I think BIS sees such a great volume of license applications that they're not, at least currently, in my experience, in the habit of sorting through all of those and going to CFIUS if they might have one. But sort of to answer the broader question, the BIS license application would occur during the diligence phase. And so you typically don't file with CFIUS until after you've signed the transaction. So it would sort of lag a little bit. Usually you try to put in your CFIUS and your DDTC notice right around the same time. And if you can, on a hard transaction, you want to do the CFIUS notice before DDTC if you can, because that process is going to run longer. So you kind of want to sort of focus on that one first and then get to DDTC.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Before we take any other questions, I thought there's a lot of international members on the line, so I thought that we could do a little networking and kind of just go around and just say where you're from and what area of law you practice, and so we can, if that works for everyone. Larry, why don't you start?
Sure. So I'm Larry Friedman. I'm a partner at Barnes, Richardson & Colburn in Chicago. We do import-export regulatory work. So Customs and Border Protection, litigation at the Court of International Trade, export controls, sanctions, and several things that butt up against CFIUS, but not really the CFIUS stuff.
Great, thank you. Adam Williams?
Thanks, Marcin. Yeah, hi, I'm Adam. I'm a partner at DMH Stallard in the UK. Alongside Nick and Clive are on the call as well. And I'm focused on employment, labour law here, but I'm particularly busy. I have another line of practice in immigration where I'm particularly busy. I don't know if you guys have heard of something called Brexit, but it's coming to a bit of a crunch time now. So yeah, do a lot around free movement and friction borders rather than frictionless borders now, and getting people in and out of the UK for work purposes. So yeah, that's what I spend most of my time looking at the moment.
Great, thanks so much. We have some from, I think, Juan Jose. Maybe he can't unmute himself on the line there. Oh. Well, why don't we skip on to Nick Williams?
Hi. So yes, Nick Williams, a colleague of Clive and Adams at DMH Stallard in London. I'm in the corporate team and do a mix of private company work, capital markets work. So from the international point of view, that would include inward investment into the UK, acquisitions of stakes or private companies, and then also do quite a bit of work on the stock exchange. So we've got 3 principal stock exchanges in the UK: the main market, the AIM market, and something called the AQSE stock exchange. And we work with companies who come to London to get a listing, as well as the brokers and financial advisors that assist them in doing so, and also with their fundraisings.
Excellent, thank you. Lois Wetzel?
It's Lois Wetzel. I'm a first-year associate at Barnes. of customs, international trade law, and then I specialize in the trade and art and activity. So sort of felt that way.
Thank you. How about Jane Jacobs from New York?
I'm Jane Jacobs from New York. I practice labor and employment. I'm a partner at Klein, Zellman, Rother, Mel Jacobs, and Chess, and we do anything related to labor and employment.
Terrific. So I don't know, Jorge? Or
George. Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi,
I can hear you.
I'm George Otero, Otero and Associates in Miami, or Coral Gables, Florida. We do primarily domestic transactions, international clients, mostly real estate.
Great.
And I have an office of one person in Chicago.
Oh, excellent. You can
The
get together.
associate.
So, Alyssa Habbard, I see she's on the line.
Yes, hi, I'm Alyssa Habbard. I'm director of the Delaware Council Group in Wilmington, Delaware. I'm a Delaware corporate transactional lawyer, so I've come across CFIUS all the time. Typically, I'm working with law firms that handle the federal end of the corporate transactions, so this would be within their bailiwick, but often sometimes called by persons outside of the U.S. to make investments and such in the U.S. So it's always good to have an overview of when the issues are triggered so you make sure you get the right person in. And that would be where I would be calling on you, today's speaker, because I handle strictly Delaware corporate areas. I do not handle federal law. So this has been very interesting for me.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. Mark?
Thank you.
Del Bianco?
Yep. Hi, Mark Del Bianco. I am a member of the Washington chapter. I'm a communications lawyer. I specialize in either international or domestic work involving communications infrastructure companies or the products that are sold by them in the indirect sales channel, or content that flows over them. So I do a lot of work also with software developers, application providers, content providers, foreign television networks that want to have distribution over streaming services, things like that. Because I do a lot of FCC regulatory, I overlap a lot with CFIUS. And in fact, John, one project that I've been working on the last couple of months, which I would have brought you in on, but another Skadden alum of ours, friend of ours, his big New York firm was handling it. But the issues that came up there were something that I think you sort of mentioned, but didn't entirely. And it was that there was an investment bank that was investing. So initially, there were not CFIUS issues, but because the investment bank potentially was going to bring in foreign investors after it got its minority stake, everyone had to plan and look at CFIUS and figure out what could be done if the sovereign wealth funds or other potential co-investors with this investment bank in fact decided to invest, and suddenly you had CFIUS triggered months after FCC approval or months after a decision had been made that you didn't have CFIUS issues. So that's something that if you have investment bank clients or investor clients, you might want to consult with John ahead of time to see whether transactions that you're contemplating down the road might trigger CFIUS issues.
Yep, I'm definitely calling on John, that's for sure. Linda, are you still on, Linda?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Linda Rahal from Washington, D.C. As Marcine, I practice business immigration law in the United States. We do a lot of EB-5 and investor green card and investor visas. And I've always heard of some connection between CFIUS and these transactions, and we also advise on the immigration aspects of mergers and acquisitions, and always have to struggle to get corporate counsel to add this to their due diligence list. And I expect CFIUS is another one we're going to say, you should add this to your due diligence list as well.
For sure. Great tip. I will do that as well. So we have someone on the phone line. It's 135. Is there somebody on the phone line?
That was me, but then I went online.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Juan Jose Lopez, are you able to unmute from Basham?
From Mexico City.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Oh,
This is
hey,
Juan
how are
Jose.
you? Hey, Jose.
I'm fine. Yeah. Well, so
There you go.
I do also most of the time foreign investment here in Mexico. I do try to help and assist all the foreign companies that are coming to Mexico, and most of the time in mergers and acquisitions, but sometimes also they started from scratch, from zero in Mexico. So any kind of activities, that's what I do most of the time.
Great. Thank you, Jose.
Marcy,
Arnie,
I've got I have like six different questions, John. So Jose sort of entrees raises one question as to whether CFIUS looks not just for investment in the United States, but has impact on transactions out of the United States, so that if there would be a transaction of investment of U.S. technology, whatever, into Mexico, would CFIUS come into play? That's one question. Second question, you mentioned sort of all the potential nexes with other practice areas, but considering I didn't see IP, data privacy, artificial intelligence. I sort of encouraged it. I don't think they're on, but Steve Wu in Silicon Valley and Joe DeMarco in New York, sort of data privacy, AI would be, good people for you to get to know if you don't know them, and them to get to know you in terms of sort of their technological expertise in these subset issues that are critically important. I'm intrigued also from the UK perspective and the Canadian and Australian perspective, where there is a foreigner that has the interest in those countries. So in other words, if a Russian has an interest in the UK, and may have nexus between Russia and UK, but sort of primarily views himself as a UK citizen or resident or whatever, and then the transaction originates from the UK, does that trigger potential because of the, I'll say, national origin of somebody? And then I'm also intrigued from an administrative point of view, with so many agencies impacting the review, how it's managed administratively, because you clear Treasury, but then you got State, you got Commerce, you got Trade. It seems like, how can they do it in 45 days or even 90 days? It just seems like a freaking mess, which is good for lawyers, perhaps, but it just seems complex in terms of accomplishing the end results. So
let's do that.
This is more than can be handled in whatever time we'll have remaining. I'll go mute,
okay.
And you can say anything you want.
Yeah, so quickly, they manage the process. Treasury is the chair. The other agencies are all voting members. They have to get a unanimous vote to clear a transaction. If it's divided, then it goes to the president. In practice, what happens is usually only one or two agencies have equities in the transaction or have interest in the transaction. Those agencies are designated as co-lead agencies in the review. And if the co-leads sign off on a transaction, then everybody else just kind of also signs off. So usually, while you have 13 who may have an opinion, it's Treasury and then one or two others who you're really working with. And so it can be messy and it can be opaque to the people on the outside, but it generally does work. On the question about a Russian who has an interest in the UK and then the investment is originating in the UK, CFIUS does ask questions about ultimate ownership. So if Russian, if they own 5% of the UK company, that's a different story than if they own 100% of the UK company. So they sort of have that ability to make distinctions there. On the question about investments outside of the US, they actually, in early drafts of the 2018 legislation, they wanted authority on outbound investments as well, specifically to stop the export of US technology. What they ended up with was they have jurisdiction over joint ventures if the US business is contributing, if the US business is contributing what could be viewed as a US business into the joint venture. If you're just licensing IP, then that's not within their jurisdiction. But if you're licensing IP and a couple of people who help work on the IP, then that counts as a US business and you have jurisdiction for that sort of transfer outside of the US. IP, AI, those sorts of issues. My list, I was intending just to list other regulatory reviews that could be triggered or could be occurring in parallel. You're definitely right that data privacy, AI, those sorts of things are very much substantive concerns for CFIUS. And I very much would like to work more closely with the INBLF members who know that stuff. Was that it?
I had a couple of things going on here. Did you deal with the export issue? In other words, Jose is dealing with investments in Mexico. Would any of your work be triggered if there were U.S. investments into Mexico?
Yeah, and it's only if the U.S. business is forming a JV in Mexico and contributing what could be viewed by CFIUS as a U.S. business. So if you're licensing IP and you're giving a couple people who might help service that IP, that would be a U.S. business, and that would be something that CFIUS can do. But generally speaking, if you're just investing dollars outside of the U.S., then they don't have jurisdiction over that.
Well, that was an amazing presentation. I think we just left out one individual for introductions, Clive Lee, the one and only Clive Lee from London, the UK.
Thanks, Marcine. I assume that was on the basis of leaving the best to last, so I'm very happy with that. Thanks very much to John for a really interesting talk. Probably more directly relevant to my colleagues Nick and Adam Williams. I'm from DMH Stallard. I'm a commercial litigation partner, so I deal with any business disputes relating to English law. Could be arbitration or ordinary court proceedings and so forth. I do a lot of trade law issues as well, so I quite often work with my corporate colleagues. But I really enjoyed the talk, and it was good to see such a good turnout. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
That concludes our presentation for today. We want to thank John for just an amazing and informative look into CFIUS. So thank you for our star panelist.